Welcome, everybody. My name is Holly Anand. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography and Planning. I'm also a member of the Global Institute of Water Security and the president of our Global Water Futures Young Professionals group. So I've been working alongside Corinne Schuster-Wallace, who is a water and health researcher with the Global Water Futures program. She's a member of the Global Institute for Water Security and an associate professor with the Department of Geography and Planning. And together we are presenting our first Women in Water lecture today. So thank you for joining us. And whether you're here at the University of Saskatchewan, thank you for braving the cold and coming out today. We also have members of our Global Water Futures community joining us online at some of the other universities. So we welcome those who are online and or anybody else who's having their own networking event today. So with that, we recognize that the University of Saskatchewan's main campus is situated on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. So as such, we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Today is also the United Nations International Day for Women and Girls in Science. So we're really excited to be able to launch this first lecture series in celebration of that day and in recognition of women in science globally. So with that, we'd also like to thank our sponsors to help events like this happen on our campus, the Global Water Futures program, the Young Professionals program within Global Water Futures, and for the Global Institute of Water Security for underwriting this event and committing resources towards it. So.
This lecture series was conceived in response to the recognition that we need more opportunities to showcase women researchers in the water sciences and provide leadership opportunities for the young professionals in water sciences. But it was also conceived to draw attention to the gendered nature of water and the need to include gender-based analyses in our research. Different people have different needs they have different access to water resources, but they're also affected differently by natural disasters, especially water-related natural disasters. And it's a result of multiple drivers. It's geographic location, it's socioeconomic factors, but it's also gender. And globally, women are the most vulnerable to and impacted by water. And there's a recent study that was launched by UN Women and UNDP this week as part of the International Women in Science. And they talked about enhancing women's agency, capabilities, and participation in decision-making processes as a key area for progress to harness gender equity, to accelerate the achievement of the UN Global Sustainable Development Goals. And in order to harness these positive influences, we really need women that are trained in the science and social science of water, but they also have to be given opportunities for leadership in water, and they have to be able to have these leadership opportunities in academia and in other water-related sectors. And this is the only way, really, that we'll actually end up with women involved in sustainable solutions that meet the needs of women within the broader needs of society. So we thank you all for being here today.
So today we have lined up the climate change and society topic or theme for our lecture series. And so each of these lectures are going to focus on a specific water-related theme. So today we have three very talented speakers from our own University of Saskatchewan joining us. And they're going to present gender-based aspects of their research that focus on this climate change and society theme. So what's going to happen today is each speaker will share their research, and we'll just transition quickly from one to the other, and then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion and then some general questions and answer sort of period from the crowd. So we'll facilitate some of the questions at the end. We have some things prepared, and then we would invite you guys to step up to the microphone there in the middle and also ask questions of our panelists. So we also have, for those of you who are joining us on the live feed, we also encourage use of the hashtag Women and Water. So we'll be following along the hashtag a little bit. And if there's questions that are also coming from the online community, we'll have Mark pull some if there are and provide them. As well, just tweeting about this event and stuff, that's the hashtag to use as women and water. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. We have Dr. Maureen Reed, who is a professor and assistant director academic at the School of Environment and Sustainability. She's also UNESCO co-chair in biocultural diversity, sustainability, reconciliation, and renewal. Her research focuses on environmental governance in support of social sustainability and resilience in rural communities. So Maureen, will you join us, please?
Okay, can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah. Thank you both to Corinne and to Holly for inviting me and the panel. It's a really wonderful opportunity to be here today. So, we live in an era of climate change. And when I'm thinking about climate change, I think about both the biogeochemical cycles that produce sort of long-term prevailing weather conditions, but also the political and social cycles that produce long-term and enduring norms about gender expectations. My research has always focused on rural, resource-based, and Indigenous communities and how they respond and contribute to environmental changes as well as social changes in environmental governance. So for over 20 years now, I've conducted research on gender in forestry, really examining how gender dimensions of forestry employment, adaptive capacity of rural communities to climate change, and economic and policy restructuring are undertaken, as well as collaborative forest arrangements relating to forest management. And recently I was placed on a panel to develop a national strategy for gender equity in forestry in Canada. So clearly that's an important goal for this government as well. And this past fall, I've also worked with colleagues, Dr. Laurie Bradford, Dr. Amber Fletcher, and a couple of students, Heidi Walker and Bethany Thiessen, on a couple of projects to better understand how research in environmental management in the global north has included gender or gender and diversity elements. And this includes research around climate change, biodiversity conservation, pollution, water management, natural resource management more broadly, and environmental impact assessment. And I can now say that across this large body of work, there's really very little research that's being done in relation to gender, environmental management, and climate change in Canada. And I think there's an assumption in Canada, along with much of the global north, that we've already addressed gender inequality, or that gender is a social dimension that really has no relevance for resource management in the sectors that we were looking at. Analysis that is being done is really in its infancy. So particular to climate change, there's really very little research on how climate change and gender relations may work together to make some social groups more or less vulnerable to the effects of climate change. I've also done, as I said, some work in collaborative governance, looking at how resource-based communities get involved in decision-making, particularly around forest management. And we've done a number of national surveys on this. Forests across Canada are obviously managed by government and industry, but they also are advised through public advisory committees across the country. Women and Indigenous peoples remain nominally and effectively underrepresented on those committees. Their representation is remarkably low. Their satisfaction and influence in those structures appears exceedingly low as well. And the structures continue to be dominated by older white men who retain very high levels of satisfaction with their participation. So in the words of one of my colleagues, they remain too male, too pale, and too stale. We've also started to track how those structures provide forums to discuss climate change, to get a sense of how rural communities are viewing these issues, and discovered that they're really not part of the deliberations of any of those participants. So I'm saying all of those things not to just talk about my work, but to tell you from which I make 4 basic observations. And the first one is that gender remains a powerful social category that influences how women and men interact and are affected by environmental change in the global north. So there's still a lot of evidence that women and men are affected by climate change in very different ways, largely because gendered norms shape the social roles of women and men in households, in workplaces, and in communities. So, for example, there remains a very strong gender division of labor in rural communities in Canada, where men continue to dominate in the extraction of natural resources as loggers, miners, offshore fishers, hunters, and firefighters. And so those occupations place men at risk when working outdoors and in climate hazard events, whether those be storms on the East Coast or fires in the Boreal. Women tend to work in health and social services in rural communities, and they confront other kinds of challenges when their communities face acute events such as through fire or flood. Those events due to climate change or through long-term structural change in their communities. Having said that, gender is not the only aspect of identity that influences how people experience environmental change, including climate change. So that a sole focus on gender is really insufficient to understand the historical and contemporary practices that may marginalize some groups or privilege others. Feminist theorists have begun to use the word intersectionality to examine how social inequality that results from multiple intersecting systems of power and privilege. So they argue that simply focusing on men and women tends to homogenize the experiences of men and women and simplifies the effects or the impacts or understanding of the impacts of climate change. So we need to think not just about men and women, but also other social factors such as race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, sexuality, education, disability or ability, and see how these factors might work together to affect access to resources, adaptive capacity, and opportunities to influence decision-making. Okay. Additionally, by thinking about diverse groups, we can also think about the diverse knowledge systems that they might be able to bring that we might learn from when we're starting to make decisions about things like climate change. However, many of those people face significant barriers. And one of those, or two of those sets of intersections that seem to be important in Canada are indigeneity and age. So in Canada, Indigenous peoples, and we'll probably hear more about this from the others, bear many of the risks associated with climate change or with resource use, partly because they're geographically close to some of the greater extremes of climate change or resource extraction, but also because of the historical and contemporary practices of colonialism. These may range from poor infrastructure to a lack of higher education as available in their communities, and this may compromise some of their self-determined adaptive capacity. Indigenous women typically feel a double burden of these intersecting forms of gendered and racialized discrimination, often having fewer opportunities for more formal leadership roles and decision-making than their male counterparts. We also see that concerns are now being expressed for Indigenous youth as they are starting to inherit the kind of world that we're leaving behind as well. There's very little work that's being done about this in relation to climate change. So I wanted to just show you a really brief example in impact assessment, environmental impact assessment. So when looking at the impacts of the Alberta oil sands, Jolly and Westman suggested that we can't understand the impacts on women and youth without fully understanding some of the legacies of colonization. So they pointed out that colonization, racism, and patriarchy work together to suppress Indigenous cultures through residential schools, for example, and rearrange gender relationships in many Indigenous societies, which end up then reverberating through impacts associated with continuous discrimination, poverty, and violence against Indigenous women. So that when we think about resource developments, we need not just to think about the specific effects, but we need to understand how they are situated within these ongoing legacies. And that provides to me some fodder for questions about how diverse communities will also confront climate change, whether that's through acute events or through slow-moving ones. Which brings me to my third point, which is that frameworks are powerful tools that academics can use to understand these dynamics. So policies or programs that we adopt to so-called resolve problems don't just emerge from nowhere, but rather they imagine policies and programs, they imagine problems in particular ways, and they establish these policies as ways to address them, so that the way we frame the problems can deliberately or inadvertently reinforce certain ways of being or certain patterns of behavior. So the Government of Canada has adopted GBA+, which is a framework for understanding gender and other social identity factors, and they have a very nice tutorial online if you want to learn more about it. And it's one of many frameworks. So feminist scholars typically are more critical of some frameworks than others. And the last point is that translating academic findings into transformative social change for sustainability remains enormously challenging. So just as we were presenting our final report around gender and other factors in relation to impact assessment, Margaret Wente provided us with a nice little quote from the Globe and Mail saying, what all this has to do with pumping oil is a total mystery. But really trying to translate that into things that governments can use is really challenging for a few reasons. A lot of the frameworks that academics use have big words, and they focus on really big structural critiques, so critiques of colonization or critiques of neoliberalism, for example. And trying to then translate ideas into really tangible recommendations that politicians can take up is a major challenge, sort of moving out of the critique mode into something more beneficial. More immediately, many academics don't have the time, skills, or the emotional energy to respond directly to the likes of Margaret Wente, although probably doing so is vital. And lastly, the burden of that challenge still often, inappropriately, remains with women. And so I'm really thrilled that Dave is here at the table to refute that particular observation. But in conclusion, I think there's a lot to do, but I remain cautiously optimistic that the climate is changing, both the biophysical climate, but also the political climate is changing, so that we can start to take serious consideration of gender and diversity in our research and in our practice around environment, sustainability, and climate change. The federal government has made gender equality a priority across all of its sectors, and we're starting to see this infiltrate into our granting organizations and across environmental sectors as well. But this isn't sufficient. We need good research, and we need good research that holds researchers to account as well. So this particular document, which has many good features of it, acting on climate change solutions there were 63 Canadian scholars, has one honorable mention of gender in it, and it was written last year. I think our work won't be sufficient unless we start to bridge with other sectors. So education, the civil society sectors, the private sector, it's really easy for us to withdraw into academia, but we really need to build bridges. We need strong allies. This kind of work is not women's work. We need allies from researchers like David Natcher. We need allies from university and research council presidents, Indigenous governments and partners, government ministries and secretaries general, private sector proponents, and community members. We need these kinds of allies to help us better understand and then to take action to improve relations across gender and diverse social groups to ensure our governance and socio-ecological systems are equitable, just, and sustainable. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Maureen. Just a reminder, we will open for questions and do some panel discussion at the end. So I'll just go right to introducing our next speaker. We have Dr. David Natcher, who's a professor in the College of Agriculture and Bioresources here at the University of Saskatchewan. The resource economics at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Natcher serves as a Canadian representative on both the International Arctic Science Committee's Social and Human Working Group and the Social, Economic and Cultural Expert Group of the Arctic Council's Sustainable Development Working Group. Dr. Natcher, it's a mouthful. You can tell us all about it. Great, thank you very much.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for the invitation to present some of the work that we've been doing. And I want to apologize at the outset. Like probably many of you, I'm suffering through a little bit of a cold, but I think I should be able to manage 10 minutes or so. I wanted to share some of the work that we've been doing over the past year or so on gender and decision-making in the Arctic. It's part of a larger research program that I and some collaborators are working on. And what I thought I'd do for this short little talk is I'm going to present a number of tables, and I think they're going to be, I think some of these figures about women in science should stimulate some conversation and some of the very pronounced inequity in Arctic science right now between men and women. So just a little bit of context. A recent article came out in Proceeding of National Academy of Science, and that took a look at the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent report. And, you know, amongst its many positive, the positive work that they're doing, they did point out that only 20% of the expert members and panel members to the IPCC report were female. And now that's an improvement from 1990 when only 5% of the report was female. But they also point out within that 20% was dominated by white, English-speaking university professors teaching at Western universities. So there's quite, even within that smaller percentage, is dominated by a certain segment. I wanted to talk about the Arctic Network Centers of Excellence. And I want to say at the outset, this is not an indictment of ArcticNet. This is one of many large research networks that we're looking at in terms of a network analysis. But I thought I'd present some of these findings today because I think that'd be of interest to the group. And ArcticNet, many of you are probably familiar with, many of you receive funding from, is the largest single benefactor of Canadian funding for Arctic science. So since 2004, approximately $363 million have been devoted to ArcticNet-related research, and that has gone to support the research of 145 researchers from 30 different universities, government agencies, and multiple countries. So this money has gone to a lot of different institutions, and a lot of people have benefited from the funding from the federal government. The objectives: develop and disseminate the knowledge needed to formulate adaptation strategies and national policies to help Canadians face the impacts of climate change. Secondarily, train the next generation of specialists that we're going to need to face or to manage Canada's Arctic for tomorrow. So ArcticNet is one of many network centers of excellence funded by the federal government, the NCE, and they do have a statement of equity, diversity, inclusion, and the participation of all qualified individuals, inclusive of members of underrepresented groups, are essential to mobilize Canada's best research. The Secretary is committed to principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, and deems them central to its programs. However, they say it's expected that all NCE-funded organizations are equally committed to those principles, something that Maureen touched on at the end of her presentation. The next few slides, I just wanted to show some figures that we went back and looked at since the start of ArcticNet. And we looked at the development in different categories of men and women researchers in ArcticNet. And you can see that women are outnumbering men 146 to 90 at the master's level. And you see a transition through the career trajectory. So at the PhD level, women are still outnumbering men. However, at the postdoc level, you start to see a flip happen, okay? Where men all of a sudden are outnumbering women within ArcticNet. And then you see a really pronounced transition when it becomes the investigator level, where men are outnumbering 195 to 51, male to female. And for project leads or principal investigators of NCE projects, 81 to 14. And at the management level, this integrated regional impact study, ArcticNet is broken into 4 general regional areas across the Arctic. 4 very senior men manage those different themes. So you see a real transition from the master's level to the really the highest rung of involvement in the ArcticNet. This is really consistent. I suspect a lot of people have seen different types of diagrams for this leaky pipe or the leaky pipeline of women in academics. And if you look at the numbers with ArcticNet, I mean, this leaky pipe really plays out within this centers or research network, where you have at that postdoc stage, you see that real transition. And that might be due to a lack of supervision. That might be because, well, is attributed to kind of domestic responsibilities and priorities. And that leads to less opportunities within professional networks and in universities, and all the way up to applying for full professorship in universities. So this leaky pipeline is really reflects well with what's going on in this one research network. We looked at project leads by year. So again, ArcticNet was established in 2004. It'll go on, I believe, for another 3 years. This data goes up to 2018. And you can see the really small representation of women in these key roles within ArcticNet. So for each year, you have maximum of 4 or 5 women leads in 2014. So you have a very small number of women taking leadership roles on these projects. Now this slide here is broken down into the themes that ArcticNet has identified as kind of the organizational framework for the network. And they're organized by marine science, terrestrial science, policy and knowledge translation is that PKT, I'm not sure if you can see it. And the last is Inuit health, education, and adaptation. So you have 4 female leads in terrestrial science, but I should say 2 of those 4 focus on Inuit traditional ecological knowledge and not necessarily mainstream terrestrial science. Also, in the last category, Inuit health, education, and adaptation, the majority of the female researchers in that category are focusing on Inuit health and not necessarily the science being conducted by ArcticNet. And that was very late into the research program of ArcticNet when health and education were introduced. We looked at the publication or the output that's generated from these networks. And you can see in terms of the authorship, ArcticNet has produced a huge mass of papers, books, reports. And in journal articles alone, they've published over 2,400. And if you look at the authorship of these papers, the men are dominating the sole authorship, where you have women have published as sole authors 218 papers compared to 1,839. Now, multiple or men and women publishing accounted for 359. But obviously, huge discrepancy in the output of the research that's being done by ArcticNet. And that has real implications in your publications, as I don't know if people saw the report that came out last week on the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the inequity of grant getting and tying that back to publication records. So we talk more about that if of interest. But significant output differences. In terms of the networks that women are able to establish, these professional networks, they're much smaller than their male colleagues, where men are typically in the network collaborating with close to 12 other colleagues. Women's networks are much smaller, 7. And that has big implications on professional development, access to resources, publications, labs, everything else. So some of the implications, and this is what we're looking at. We have really great numbers, but we now want to ground this in some experiences of people who are involved in networks. So the lack of female role models and professional mentors, in the interviews that we've been doing, that has been a really common concern of some of the young female academics, not having mentors to turn to. Where are their professional networks? Who do they turn to for professional advice? And that's often what's lacking from these types of networks. Stagnant professional development, limited access to resources and funding, fewer publications and recognition. And the Canadian Institute of Health Research Report made that really clear. The lack of publications is leading to less grant getting by women who are applying to these different funding opportunities. In terms of research, the bias towards male knowledge systems influence the tone and content of the research and how that research is conducted. It's a single voice that's really directing the research program within these large networks. So some of the takeaways. Again, I want to stress that this isn't an indictment necessarily of ArcticNet. I've been involved in a number of other NCEs and large research networks in Canada, and they're very much the same. I mean, that's not letting them off the hook here, but this isn't unique to ArcticNet alone, as the IPCC report shows at the international level. It also, I think it's important to keep in mind, as Maureen mentioned, the intersecting of these barriers, gender, ethnicity, language, all these other factors influencing the equitable participation in of women in these research programs. Increasing the participation of women in science will not only promote fairness, but it will result in better, more informed science. Having multiple perspectives, different life experiences, and bringing that into the research programs. And last, including the collective abilities of female scholars is not tokenism, but rather the best way to address complex challenges like climate change in the Arctic, what Nielsen has identified as innovative dividends of inclusion. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'm sure some good discussion will come out of those figures. So next up we have Maria Mora, who is a PhD candidate here from the University of Saskatchewan. She's a student in School of Environment. And Maria is a Ecuadorian PhD candidate. Her work focuses on the challenges present in the current water governance system in Indigenous territories in Canada, to present new alternatives built from the Indigenous needs, world's views, and knowledge. Please join us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this day and to share with such remarkable researchers that I know and I've read through my PhD program a lot. I would like to present you today the results of a scoping review that was done in the topic of gender and water governance. And in this work, I had the luck to being supported by 3 great social and natural scientists, which are Dr. Maureen Reed, my supervisor, Dr. Lalita Bharadwaj, and Dr. Lori Bradford as well. So in the literature, we found that there is an increased concern on water challenges versus the decreased access to secure water for marginalized groups, including women. There are strong calls for advancements in water governance to address unequal gender participation and decision-making. Specifically in the global north, research on equal gender access to secure water seems to be limited and overlooked. There are misunderstandings about women's water governance roles, which usually are categorized into simplification and vulnerabilities instead of a real participation of women into decision-making. With this in mind, we developed our scoping review, focusing our study in the global north, involving a multidisciplinary team of 4 researchers and supported by a political studies research librarian. And we follow the framework developed by Arksy and O'Malley, which mainly follows 5 main steps: the identification of the research question, the identification of the relevant studies, the study selection, charting the data, and finally collating, summarizing, and reporting the results. We identified 6 main databases that, in addition to other records, we had in our first search a total of 579 results. After processes of deduplication, abstract screening, and full text reading articles, we end up having 26 articles that meet the criteria for this study. We found that the literature on this topic starts to be more visible since 2006. And 2013 was the year with the most published articles, due mainly to a special issue of the Journal of Cleaner Production. 43 authors contributed to 22 papers, and from these 43, 34 were women. The literature were mainly published in engineering, gender and feminist, geography, rural, environmental management, and water journals. So we categorize and analyze our information into 6 main themes. The first one, need of water and new water governance approaches. As I mentioned before, there are strong concerns for access to water that are more evident for marginalized groups, including women. Such concerns call for important advancements in water governance. Most authors, 15 from the 26th, emphasize the need for different water governance approaches that attend gender equal participation and decision-making, and that they are locally bounded, or they are responding to the local needs. The second theme, opposing approaches. So there are 2 opposite debates around water and gender. One focuses on the effects of neoliberalism on water governance, which has legitimized practices of unequal gender access to water. It exposes critiques to the foundations of neoliberalism in relation to the monetary value that water has, lacking the incorporation of the political, social, environmental, psychological values that has intensified scarcity and unequal access. On the other hand, there are feminist critiques urging managers to value and incorporate women's decision-making within the current water governance system. They critique the current power dynamics, the gender inequalities, and their relationships with poverty, marginalization, and racial identities, and they promote the diverse roles that women play into water governance and their holistic knowledge. However, these 2 opposite arguments are directed to specific public targets, keeping the message trapped in specific circles, or sort of like preaching to the converted. And this situation could represent a weakness for the consolidation of gender approaches in water governance. The third theme, women's innovative roles. The literature shows that despite women's roles are narrowly categorized in real life, the roles are not limited to household sanitation manager and cook, water hauler, water financer, water board ethics manager, water educator, innovative leader, sovereign water user, social manager, community nurturer, water memory keeper, hostile water climate decision maker. In fact, the narrow view of perceived contributions of women to water governance hinders the actual incorporation of the wide experience and practical innovation of women to deal with water issues. Taking one approach to advance the critique of another approach does not help to incorporate completely the advance of women's involvement and innovation into water governance. Research shows that women are innovative in searching for practical and novel ways to deal with water issues, their children and households' well-being. In the next theme, we reflect on the importance of women's knowledge. So women have different roles, responsibilities, and reactions to critical water situations. Women daily are forced to find the best solution for her household's well-being, finding different meanings of water and attachments to water. Thus, women's holistic practical knowledge on water represents the social and ecological knowledge that women have beyond the economic perspective that usually prevails into water decision-making. Interdisciplinarity and knowledge mobilization. The challenges of water governance are described as interdisciplinary and needing multiple communication forms and channels to share knowledge and practices. Part of the problem is that creating a gender platform amidst all the interdisciplinary needs to solve water governance problems is difficult. So in the past, gender researchers have found entry points by essentializing women's connections to nature. Current advocacy is pulling away from that to better represent the wide ways that women know water and to encourage more interdisciplinary considerations of gendered issues in water governance. Several articles described innovative ways that women communicate and share information about water that transcend traditional gender and intersectional boundaries. For example, the sister watersheds or the permanent learning circles. The last theme, the uninclusion of gender in the global north. Gender balance for holistic water governance is evolving from different contexts, stages, and processes in the global north and south. However, there is more research emerging in the southern context. This review provides support to the need for more research in the global north, because research on equal gender access to secure water seems to be limited and overlooked. Increased research on water governance and gender is urgent if we acknowledge that water injustices present in the global north are linked to processes of colonization which have marginalized Indigenous people. Land and resources dispossessions have been part of Indigenous life since colonization, affecting jurisdictional power, culture, voice, and worldviews. These social, cultural, political, and even spiritual dispossessions have negatively affected their traditions and beliefs, especially for women, who are now claiming for active participation into water decision-making. As conclusions, where we are now and where we need to be. As a result of this review, we found that gender in the water discussion is mainly focused on women's roles and participation and the disadvantages that are present in the water dynamics. We also found that the global north is being as an spectator of the gender problems happening in the south without reflecting much on the complexities present in their territories. We also found out research and publication on gender issues in water governance in the global north need to be expanded, acknowledging that gender equality is not a rule for all women present in this part of the world. There are different frameworks proposed for water governance and gender in the global north, but these haven't been deep tested to see practical results. It is important to notice that in the discussion we have a sibling rivalry approach to talk about gender and water governance, which seems not being enough helpful to address broadly the complex issues present. There are few women working on the field and publishing. It is important to start to reflect on gender problems and water governance to move the agenda into practical approaches and even solutions. And finally, gender is mainly touched in special issues, so we need to widen the array of research and publication to affirm that the global north is gendered balanced. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our panelists today. And while you're thinking up your questions and online, don't forget to tweet to #WomenAndWater, and we'll pick up those questions and we'll ask them on your behalf. I just would like to pose a couple of questions to the panel, as I say, to give you a chance to think through what you'd like to ask. There have been some really fascinating insights on gender and water, both in terms of the practical, the academic, and the policy. And I'd like to start by asking all of you, what can be done to reduce some of these disparities? And you're right, it's not just in water science, it's in health science and other, the American Geophysical Union, there was something in Nature recently about particularly young professionals there. How do we actually empower change in practice? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll just, I think Maureen touched on this, and I put a slide up on mine that the Network Centers of Excellence said they are committed to this policy of inclusion and representation of underrepresented groups, and they have the expectation that all their funding networks will have the same type of commitments. And that doesn't seem strong enough to me. I mean, I think you're starting to see that some of these research networks and funding agencies are demanding more accountability. But I think, there has to be more than an expectation that they're going to have this shared sense of inclusiveness in their, who they fund and what type of work's done. So I think you're starting to see that legislated more into these types of programs and research networks. But it does have to go beyond just this expectation of goodwill. So.
I think that it is important to provide more spaces for this discussion, for this type of discussions, because, like Maureen said, we tend to think, especially like in these countries, in the developed countries, that gender issues are not big or are not even present sometimes. That's the perception that sometimes we have from the South. So the opportunity to have this type of discussion and exchanges, I think, need to be encouraged into universities or into public spaces to bring, to acknowledge and to be more mindful that this equality is not present still here in Canada, for example.
Maybe I could just underscore sort of a general theme that I hear coming from Dave and from Maria, and that is, I think, that we need to work at all levels. So, very locally, we need to look at ourselves and in terms of some of our informal practices, as well as at a higher order of decision-making that introduces certain kinds of more formal or regulatory requirements. And I think that those formal requirements need to change, and they will change over time. What I think is the more difficult piece is some of the unconscious bias that may be what we assume is so-called good research, for example, what we assume are objective criteria for understanding what is good research or the academic records of others. And I think those are the ones that are the more difficult piece and the ones that would really benefit from the kinds of discussions that Maria was talking about.
Thank you. I have one last question before I open it up to the audience, and that is, what, if any, advice would you have for young female professionals at this point in time?
I'd have two. One is time management, is a very practical one. But I think what Dave also pointed out was the network piece. And what I learned at actually the first meeting that we had on this national strategy for forestry is not just that women lack networks, that the size of their networks is smaller, but that women actually may not know how to network effectively, or alternatively, maybe the rules of networking themselves need to change. But we need to not just set up network programs, we need to understand whether there are strategies for networking that may be more effective than others.
I think that I could recommend to time management. I think is crucial for sure, because I'm single, but I can see from other colleagues, friends of mine that have other different responsibilities. It is very difficult for them to spend the time into academia, into work, and that could be a strong barrier. So that type of, I don't know, like help to women to organize their time and to organize their daily duties could be useful for the young professionals, that beyond just being as a student or as a professional, they also have other responsibilities.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, in just my own experience with female graduate students, I encourage them to seek out a mentor, outside of just working with me. My experiences as a white male in academics is going to be fundamentally different than many of my students. So I think they have to, broaden that network, find a mentor, and rely on them as much as they possibly can. The other thing, and it triggered a thought that Maureen mentioned, this unconscious bias. And this is more of a recommendation, I think, for my colleagues than for students, in that there's been some really fascinating studies that have come out about the way letters of recommendation are written for male and female graduate students. And there was just a big study completed of 5,000 letters of recommendation from geophysical sciences, and found that, based on a discourse analysis, they found that the women were most often described as organized, hardworking, and these types of descriptive terms like that, when the male PhD students were described as brilliant, critical thinking, and when I read that, I went right back to all the letters of recommendation I've read in the past, like, oh my God, am I guilty of this? But I think that that's something to be very aware of, as we may think we're trying to do the best that we can for our students, but maybe there's some bias there that actually hurts the students, the female students.
Thank you very much. Anyone in the audience or online? if you would, please step up to the mic so that everybody in the audience and online can hear the questions. And if not, I have a whole list.
Hello. Thank you, all the speakers. It was awesome. I would like to ask Professor Reed a question. If you could please elaborate ideas, more details actually, on the impact of climate change on women, but specifically in relation to their reproductive roles and motherhood. How do you see that? Thank you.
Well, I could only say I haven't myself done any research on that, and I haven't seen a whole lot of research about that except as it relates to family separation during evacuations. That has frequently happened and been very traumatic for families, particularly that has happened in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta when fires have taken place in families. Because often it's young children or elders who end up becoming evacuated first. That's been the triage kind of model that's been used, and that's had devastating effects when there are women and children that may want to actually remain together during a particular event. That's been rethought a little bit. In terms of other forms of reproductive roles, in terms of social reproduction, women have often ended up being in certain kinds of caregiving roles in their communities, and that places another form of stress on them. I know there's been work in Australia around drought, for example, where women are often in roles of emotional support as caregivers in their communities, and they also come home and their husbands are actually doing the farming, and they are facing a lot of sort of anguish around those drought situations. It's also happened in fire events as well. So I would say that there are a number of ways in which women have sort of unique positions within their communities that can affect them.
Anyone else? Oh.
First off, thank you to the speakers for the great presentation. And there's been a lot of discussion here about the makeup of academics, but I was wondering if you could perhaps speak to the makeup of the decision makers in the North, so the government employees, what their makeup is, if any of you have any knowledge about that.
When about a year ago, when a lot of our work began, it was part of a panel on women in leadership in the Arctic, and a lot of the speakers from across the circumpolar were there to talk about the very influential roles that women are taking in Greenland, northern Canada, and the inspiration that they're having for this next generation of young leaders in the Arctic. I can't speak to it, with any real authority, but I know in my own work, the people of real influence in northern Canada right now are young women. I mean, not all, but certainly a very large representation of people of influence are young women. So I think people are very excited about that in the North, as they should be, and these future decision makers. You're probably going to see maybe a new direction in the North. So.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question on that. Is that young women taking on the mantle and the advocacy and becoming that voice, or is it a transition in this sort of standard power and policy and decision-making that's actually transitioning to those younger female voices? Don't know. No, it's just very interesting. And particularly in Indigenous water, a lot of young women have taken on that stewardship role around water and water resources, and obviously water fetching at a more global perspective. And so is it that women are standing up and reclaiming or claiming those roles? But nothing online? Nope.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. This is a project that, that Maureen and I were involved with a former School of Environment student, Kiri Staples. And she looked at the role of women in leadership positions, particularly for wildlife management boards. And, it was very consistent with other parts of the world where, women are taking on these roles, or in some cases not taking on these roles, because often it's just extra work for the women. And we looked at co-management boards in particular, and the very small percentage of women who are on these boards, and these are often unpaid positions. Time has to be spent away from the community and home, and it's just one more burden that's often added on to women on top of labor commitments, domestic responsibilities, and it's often just, one more thing that they just can't take on. So these they're turning away from these leadership positions, not necessarily because they want to, but because there's just not enough time in the day. Is that essentially what we found?
And that echoes some work that I've seen in East Africa. The Honourable Maria Mutagamba was a really forward-thinking Minister of Water and Environment, and she put a policy in place that every community water management committee had to have a woman. And then when she went around visiting these communities, couldn't understand why there wasn't a woman there, and realized that in creating the policy, she hadn't given the women the tools to be able to step up and engage, and so was able to put some practical supports in place. And also it was found that women as financial officers in these community boards, actually the community boards did much better, and so that was another kind of shout out for women anecdotally. But absolutely, it's, if you want to hear these voices and engage different people, and it's not just women, this is all gender, all walks of life, all socioeconomic status, we need to be asking people the right questions and meeting them where they are. Because if you have a meeting at a focus group at tea time, then you won't get many women out to your focus group. So it's a very real point. Thank you. What about your experience from home? Do you have anything that you'd like to share with us about sort of women and water?
Yeah, well, in Ecuador, I think the situation for women the situation is a little bit more complicated. The paternalistic roles that are embedded in the society are very strong, plus the few economic opportunities that women have to get education, to get a work, to get a job, are not so many. So the challenges are very are big, or bigger than what I have seen here so far. And for us as women, the opportunity to study abroad, to go outside, is not a rule for everyone. The majority of my friends, my women friends that have been studying with me, I think I can count with my hand how many we are abroad. Most of us are single. But the most challenging fact, I think, is the social and cultural aspect so embedded in the society to rely women in a second place, and that males are the ones that take the leadership on every single aspect in the politics, at universities, at home. It's very strong, and it's a challenge and a fight that women, I think, we are now doing in Ecuador to raise our voices, to call for more rights for women, and especially to diminish the violence that women face back home.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have any final comments that you're burning to say. No? We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, speakers, and those who posed questions in the audience. We really appreciate your participation in this Women in Water lecture series, and I think this has been a fantastic beginning to our lecture series that we hope to be able to run through the winter every year here for the next little while, or as long as the funding lasts. So really appreciate that. We'd also like to give a little shout out to Mark Ferguson and Morgan Bratton. They've been the technical and communications support behind us getting ourselves organized. So really, really appreciate the time that you guys have committed to this. So thank you very much. With that, I guess we'll wrap things up. Thank you again very much. Our next lecture is happening on a pretty quick turnaround here. We're trying to do one a month, but January got bumped a little bit. So our next lecture is going to be March 1st. So it's only actually a couple of weeks away. We have Heidi Swanson coming from the University of Waterloo. We have Patrick Lloyd-Smith from here at the U of S in Agriculture and Bioresources as our young professional who's a new professor here on campus. So we also have Michelle Johnson-Jennings, who's also from U of S and doing Indigenous studies, as her department. The theme for the next lecture is ecosystem services. So hopefully we'll see some of you again in the crowd and online. The lecture will be at NHRC next time. So be ready for that change. We'll have a poster and our announcements coming out shortly. So please stay for a little while. There's coffee and some cookies at the back. One of the goals of this lecture series is also to provide a bit of time for that network building. So feel free to approach our speakers and ask questions as you may. And that's that. Thank you very much.